Hey girl gang, hey super mamas, it's Dr. Joy here and you're watching Delivering Joy MD TV. We're continuing our series, The Rebirth of Joy, reclaiming the reproductive health and rights of Black birthers. So today is episode 2 and I am so excited about the special guest that I have today. She has been committed to birth work for a very long time and is a very respected voice in the birth work community. She is a certified holistic doula and a researcher and educator in the birth work space. So make sure you keep watching and stay tuned to meet Shaconna Haley. All right, so today we are going to be talking about the culture in the birth world and how we've gotten to this place. And I have a wonderful guest, Ms. Shaconna Haley, a certified holistic doula who's been committed to birth work and social research for many years. She's an educator of doulas and of birth workers and has been here in the state of Georgia for quite some time and is a well-known, well-respected voice in this community. Welcome, Shaconna.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Dr. Joy.
You are always someone who is sought after when people want to know about the birth work that's happening around the state of Georgia. And when there are folks who are interested in learning more about doulas, particularly Black doulas. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this birth work space and what made you choose to become a doula?
Oh, okay. So it was very much by happenstance. My best friend became pregnant when we were like 26 years old, her and her husband. And she started inviting me to, while she was pregnant. Now I'm not pregnant, but I'm committed to women and girls development at the time, doing rites of passage programs, and just always kind of been in that realm of empowerment of women and girls. And she invited me to come to her Natural Parenting from the Start group because there was such interesting discussion going on, she said, like between teens who are pregnant to, full-time professionals. And I was like, okay, I go. And it was fascinating to see all these different dynamics of birth and how that interacts with their reproductive life cycle, which kind of aligned with my rites of passage interest. A year later, I become pregnant with my son, and the leader of that group actually becomes my doula because she was this powerhouse attorney in DC, who's in the DC area, and she also ran these groups and had two she had 2 birth center births, which was a good guide for me because that's where I ended up having my child at a birth center. So it gave me kind of this very well-rounded look at women in this specific reproductive life marker of birth. As I got to how do I support birth, partners in birth, all these things, Penny Simpkin moving up, it was like, oh, okay. All my friends started saying, what's that stuff? Come help me at my birth. So for 7 years, I did that. That was my first, just 7 years showing up at my friends who were, I call them repeat offenders, having multiple babies, including my best friend. Y'all got 3 kids. I still have my one. But that whole example of my doula, strong women in birth, women who are vulnerable, but are strong. And how can we get to address these issues that come up when I'm now in doctoral school? I'm a therapist at the time that my best friend, was having a baby. But then by that time, I'm in doctoral school as a sociologist, focusing on racial and social justice and looking at childbirth education. And I was like, well, what affects decision-making in childbirth? Then we get to the social and historical narratives around the Black body. That's kind of how my research evolved as a sociologist. And then it just kept building from there. And then I moved to Atlanta and I became a lead doula. Didn't intend to, I was just doing my research. Didn't intend to continue doing it anyway, but I got a job working as the lead doula for a doula project that was funded. And then that led to, I left there and I was like, well, I guess I'm just gonna start in a holistic, switching from focused on community work like I did in DC, rites of passage and such, and really anchor it in birth and prenatal and birth doula services. So it became that, but now I've evolved into holistic, being a just a kind of a font of development for doulas, birth workers, and perinatal health advocates, perinatal mental health, since that's my origination, and looking at Black women's development as birth workers in that, and creating Inner-Light Holistic Doula Mentorship Circle, where my mentees come, and not only are they learning about themselves in that, they're also learning how to witness and show up for families in a very holistic, targeted way where we can help all women evolve through their experience, but specifically the family, the health and wellness of the family as the focus, which trickles back to the Natural Parenting to the Start group. You can kind of see this line that aligns with my life already with rites of passage, and then just focusing on a specific time of life from preconception into postpartum. And that's kind of how it continues to evolve. But now I'm more focused, if I have a strong birth worker, doula, aspiring midwife, I still am working with this woman who's going to show up for families. And I need them to be strong and understanding what their truth is, to be able to support and shine and hold space for the families that show up, the human beings in front of them, which that's kind of the key point in terms of what are our lived experiences and realities as birth workers, Black women, supporting other Black women, and how society has influenced that, and how as well as the narrative that gets created through our families. That kind of links to kind of our conversation in terms of this racism built into the culture, because we're really combating a lot of that in our narrative that we carry.
That, I think, is what really brings this conversation full circle today, because when we think about the historical context that Liz Liba and I talked about in episode 1, it brings you back to think about, okay, if you have all of this history of people bearing all of these indignities, and then you have these families that may have been separated, and you have folks who were not able to necessarily bond with their children or stay with their children, and then that creates all kinds of psychological issues, and we're going to talk about psychological issues in our third conversation in this series. But when we think about how the culture was built and the systems were built, then we come to this place where we're like, wow, what do we need to do to combat some of those issues, like you said, and think about how are we going to show up for each other? How do we reclaim the connectivity and reconnect those families and reconnect those women with themselves, and be able to say, okay, yes, we survived all of this. Now, what do we want to do to reclaim our joy, to reclaim our anticipation, to reclaim that positive narrative in the birthing space? So, as a holistic doula, as you were doing your research and you were planning to start to help women achieve the sort of birthing space that they wanted, how did you experience the culture of birth as you started to show up in some of these spaces and to advocate for women?
So first, in terms of what birth doulas do, because there's 3 types of doulas: antepartum, birth or labor doula, and then a postpartum doula. Doulas show up and provide emotional, psychological, and physical support, advocacy, and we educate. And in that way, I say we are resource managers, then linking them with information. So in terms of that, what are your options in birth? Having informed consent, etc. So that you can make the best decisions possible and have a relationship with your provider in which there's shared decision making. Now, we'll come back to that in a second. So in terms of how I, entered in, it's very interesting, because the first, I was like, I'm not going to do this with other people. Why would I do that? Just my friends. But of course, as part of your training, you do have to do births, and most of the births are at hospitals. My first birth was fascinating because it was a mom who was on her 3rd baby, and she had a doula. She had a traumatizing birth. This is so me gathering the stories of doula so I can best support her in this next birth. And her first birth was somewhat traumatic. The second birth, she had a doula, and that helped her. But that doula moved away, so she needed a new doula. So she had a real good sense of herself in going to the hospital. But I would say, so what I'm distinguishing here now is someone who I don't know versus the hospital births I did with my friends. So, but both times, I'm thinking of one friend in particular, what was aligned with this woman was she kind of knew her body. She knew how long she would need. She knew she had a great sense of her strength in, I can get to a certain place and then I will need to go to the hospital. Like very discerning, you know. So I was like, great. So I was like, okay, the contractions are here. And then I will, you know, at this point, they're like 3 minutes, 4 minutes. I think by the time we get to the hospital, I'll be almost ready. Very much laboring at home until you're ready. And so I think for her, for the third baby, it went kind of quicker than she thought. Because she was like, yeah, you can come to the house. But then they're like, we're going to get in the car. You just meet us there. So anyway, the long and short of that part is, and I'll give you a contrast after this, is that when I got to the hospital, she was walking in slowly on her own. And they had told me, oh, this is the room she'll be in. She comes in, they've been laboring. She had a bruise from the tennis ball where he was just kind of pushing on the pressure point. She's like, I don't care, I'll heal. Please keep pushing. The doctor comes in. He's like, oh, great. You have a doula. I'll just go ahead. Just, you know, just go ahead. I'll come back when you're ready to push. It's great. I was like, what? I'm like fresh, because this is not my friend now, okay? I'm like, oh my God. Okay, but I really think she's about to start pushing. And I was like, what's going on? Right, that kind of thing. But that was like a lot of trust in process, in retrospect, right? Because literally maybe 3 minutes after she started doing the grunt to push, I was like, I said to the nurse, go get him. I don't know why he left. I was all freaked out with it. What did he leave for? Deliver the baby?
This is not my job.
This is not my job. Not my job. I'm like, I'm not doing that. But he came in right as the baby's head started to crown. He came back and I was like, I saw the hair. Anyway, so having that experience and then being a different experience, years later, more experience now and going into hospital and really helping my clients amplify their own voices with questions, clarifying, that kind of thing. Not necessarily, it's not my job to like take it over. But if I'm like the only support person, that's the only time I talk, when there's a solo mom, right? But otherwise, it's like, no, they speak for themselves. And that's what that's why we do the shared decision-making conversation. And I'll attend a doctor's appointment so we all know each other. They're not seeing me for the first time, at least a couple, if they're in a practice, at least a couple of them know, and then they like, oh, she has a doula and whatever, what have you. But then I have another experience of going in with a mom who was a solo. And she was a graduate student who didn't have money and no support whatsoever. A lot of kind of traumatizing things into her pregnancy. She tried to get some access to support when she was put on the Medicaid with women who didn't have money, essentially. She felt like she wasn't getting the same type of treatment or care, even in these things that are supposed to be helping them educate and prepare. So she was reading more. And I happened to meet her through a colleague who knew her as a graduate student in the same program, and like, you should talk to Shaconna. She does doula work. And she said, I've heard about doulas. I just need some help. And she did. So like we bartered, which is not anything I quite do in the same way now. But I'm like, you don't have to do anything. I just want to make sure you're okay. But she would cry constantly saying like, I feel like I'm getting talked down to every time I go in. It's because I don't have money. And she's like, when you're really this highly educated person and you're in this extra vulnerable state, it really makes a difference it takes a hit at your identity when you're already going through the mommy shift identity and I'm going to have a child and I don't know what that is. But she was very strong, big and tall woman. I'm kind of short, but big and tall woman. And I'm like, okay, this is going to be an interesting journey. But we get to the hospital when she's in labor. I labor with her at home to a point, and then I say, okay, it seems like now you're ready to go. When we get there, and she's struggling to hold on to who she is, meaning the nurse comes in and she's kind of dismissing the things my client is saying. And all I do is like, I think that she said such and such. You know, I just repeat what she said, or I'll ask a clarifying question because I'm big at that. And then it's like, she didn't really hear. And this is a non-Black nurse speaking to her and kind of just dismissing some of what she was saying about what she was experiencing. We get into a room, this was in triage. And then she said, what I'm trying to tell you, and so she has to come all outside of herself, outside of, you know, what we talk about now in terms of Delta, just really being in her labor where we had her when we walked into the hospital, to this trying to just say, listen, I told you I'm like in pain, and she's just trying to communicate. And I really just need you to hear me. Like, ooh, okay. I'm like, to me, I'm like, oh, let me see, maybe I got to talk now, because I don't need her going off the rails to be something that she doesn't need to be in her labor when she was okay before that. Meaning okay dealing with her contractions.
Right. Like she shouldn't have to fight for herself right now. She should be in a place where she's safe and cared for.
Right. And so she could feel that this dismissiveness. So that's what I felt in the room. Right. And ultimately we are in this full-blown laboring thing. Of course, she grips my shoulders and I'm like, oh my God, so she's very strong. But in that space of time, I think no one really asked her anything about how she was. You know, I observed that during that time. And I think it stayed with her. Now, I knew her for like several years afterward, but it stayed with her, and she started to become just an advocate for women in general, ultimately. But she really struggled with, you know, trusting providers after that, right?
What do you think? What do you think? You know, those are two very different experiences. What do you think was the difference? Like, why the contrast?
Well, bias of money, because the first client, I didn't say she was non-Black. I really, because that was like, oh, you're the doula, to not even, one, they didn't even acknowledge me, but they don't have to, because it's really not about me. But two, just that this is a woman by herself, and let's speak to this human. Let's speak to the human in front of me to really connect with, even in the few minutes that you're there, how are you? And just tell me what you're experiencing. It wasn't even that type of conversation. And I think because of her insurance and where she was situated, she was dismissed. And I think that had to do with bias. I think that had to do with already in the system, this, and this is this big, tall Black woman, get ready for her. And now she's somewhat yelled at me, depending on who the person looking at. I didn't see her yelling. But she had to, come outside herself to say, no, please help me, and and I'm like, at that time, I'm like, how do we navigate this person who's being dismissive? So I'm trying to strategize on that. The distinction for me was a class issue, definitely some type of bias in terms of stature, probably, but definitely some racism in the system, or from that specific person at the same time. Systemically, in terms of insurance and how you get treated, but also the individual biases and racist constructions of who's in front of you.
I think that that's something that we all deal with, and not only that, but it's so interesting because I see it played out on a regular basis. Like there's small things, and many of them are implicit biases where people just kind of, there's a culture of, I look at this person one way, I look at that person another way.
Yep.
There have been lots of studies that have come out where Black women's pain, or Black people in general, their pain is not perceived as important or as severe. There were even studies that I read about Black children who had broken bones. not being treated with the same amount of pain medicine or pain control.
Right.
So
Right.
there is definitely just a systemic sin
Right.
where Black folks just don't receive the same level of health care
Yeah.
that non-Black people do in this country, and there's certainly an issue there. Immigrants, Black folks, poor
Yeah.
folks
Yeah.
certainly do not receive the same level of care as our folks with higher socioeconomic status,
Right.
and I don't even know if we could, and we have to be frank and say that racism plays a definite role because even
Yeah.
Black people with the means and the education
Exactly.
don't get
Exactly.
the same care.
Exactly.
So we talk about that culture
Yeah.
in which a Black physician,
Right.
recently we had a Black pediatrician who passed
Mhm.
away who did not get
Yes.
appropriate
Yeah.
care. We talk about Serena Williams and Beyonce and these other people who
Mhm.
have name recognition and money who
Still.
get, so it's very interesting to me. What do you think it is that has driven this culture specifically in birthing? I hear stories about how back in the day when hospitals were segregated, black
Mhm.
and many Black women delivered at home, and they were connected
Mhm.
with other Black women, and they took care of each other. And we
Right.
hear about the granny midwifery system.
Midwife.
um,
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that. What was that culture like when you were, as you did research on these things?
Yeah. So, the taking care. So when you're in a communal sense, I'm going to say that kind of generically. When you are held in love and in community, we thrive better. It
Hmm.
doesn't even matter. All things considered, we thrive, even with some complication, right? The granny midwives, what they brought was a connection and relationship and a knowingness, right? And this is what I speak to in terms of authoritative knowledge of self. And that can get reflected back, when you represent that and that love and community. We do support each other in a certain way that honors your space and time. And I think the granny midwives brought that specifically, and that love, that support, and the knowledge. Granny midwives brought that stability and that continuity of care that we kind of see now with doulas, right? But the continuity of care, she's going to show up. As soon as she got a sense, this is that holistic, intuitive part of it. She got a sense like, oh, I think I need to start walking, and walking to serve and, this family who's about to have a baby. And she get there and prep her things. Cleanliness in an order and a procedure that was there, right? So again, we have the love, the community, the expertise, the knowingness, what she knows and understands, not just as a woman, but a woman of the community who's respected for what she brings. And she's mama. She's just mama to the community. That love is important. I think that communal love is important. And there's no other things coming in other than serving this family. And then we have this disruption that happens and bringing the granny midwives forward. It's kind of like their methods are used against them to undercut them. Their methods, which are cleanliness, preparation, all the tools that they need, and their way of prepping and preparing for and serving a family, are then flipped and demonized because they're not in a hospitalized situation. The OB structure took over, right? And they kind of used their tools against them, even though it was a consistent, cared for, successful, not that there weren't any, every practice has some demises. I'm not going to negate that. But mostly at home birth where you're safe in your home with your family is a positive experience. And I think the granny midwives set the tone for that in their presence in community. In community, you're safe and you can thrive. And I think that's the overarching thing that granny midwives bring. But then we have, okay, there are things that do need other outcomes that need services. But I think the exclusion of granny midwives from that has now led to the exclusion of that presence in terms of home birth midwives and still trying to bring the same type of energy. But we have to give honor and respect to the granny midwives
Yeah, and
who.
I think
Mhm.
that's really interesting. I was watching a documentary about the granny midwifery system and how they birthed all of these babies,
Mhm.
and not just black babies, but they were
No.
also
Mm-mm.
called on by
All the
white
babies.
families,
Yes,
all
all the
babies,
babies.
all throughout the American South.
Mhm.
Because
Exactly.
they had better outcomes than a lot
Mhm.
of the white doctors, because that was
Doctors.
at a time when there was no regulation for
Right.
medical practice. And
Right.
anybody could sell snake oil on the corner. So
Mm.
the granny
Mhm.
midwives were the ones who had better outcomes,
Better
and people
outcomes.
were just doing whatever. But
Mhm.
then by the 1970s,
Yeah.
um, hospitals had kind of taken over, and there was this fee for service, and there was money
Right.
to be made from
Right.
deliveries, and then but there was still a lot of segregation. There was still a
Mhm.
lot of frank racism, and so now
That
black
part.
women were showing up in this space where
Yes.
there may be no black doctors, no black
None.
nurses,
None.
folks who may not necessarily care for black bodies. So I
Yeah.
think that that has all potentiated,
Mhm.
um, along with the social determinants of health. I think that's potentiated
Right.
this whole issue that we're seeing now with black
Right.
women having higher
Right.
complication rates, black women not necessarily being treated respectfully in the birth
Yes.
space.
Right.
So I think that all of that, having been built into the culture, is a real issue, and it's a problem. And now we're kind of having to go back and do research to collect data to prove something that we
Already
currently
know.
know, right? We inherently know it, but
We
we have to
know.
have hard facts and data to get people
Data.
to believe it. Um,
Right.
so I
Right.
think
Right.
it's so interesting to me.
In terms of supporting our families, in much the way of the granny midwife, Black women have still shown up for their friends and family in birth. So that part. So that's where you have the community doula part in your community showing up like that. Committed to community doula, right? We have that. But there is an important role of understanding how Black bodies have been treated that has to stay with the Black and brown birth workers who are serving these women. So, in coming up with the Inner Light Holistic Doula Mentorship Circle, I had to think about, because I kept having midwives say, oh, all doulas don't do it like you do. And I'm like, well, I mean, sure, they have their own way, but we all emotional, psychological, physical, like we all do that. We all, well, no. But I think the issue that I found key is the development of that doula specifically. It's all about their self-development and then serving the family, you see. So I have them read Sisters of the Yam. I have them read Medical Apartheid, Killing the Black Body. I have them read Birthing Justice is Newer. So we end with that realm. Survivors Who Give Birth. Like, so having them read certain things so they have it in their coffer and they can process their own understanding, filter through their stuff somewhat, because again, we can't bring all this into the room, right? You're here to witness the family.
I think that is so amazing. And, as we kind of wrap up this conversation on culture, I want to ask you a very specific, even a personal question.
Uh-oh.
Because this is a journey I've been on maybe for the past 4 years or so. And I recognized in myself that I was born or brought up into the culture that exists in hospitals now.
Mm-hmm.
And that even though I am a black woman,
Mm-hmm.
there are probably things that I have thought and
Yes.
said and done
Yes.
that have not been helpful for black women,
Yes.
you know. And I have to own that and feel that and know that.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, as we start this journey towards a better culture
Yeah.
of birth for black birthers, what do you think are some, or maybe just one thing, what is something helpful that Black birth workers, or even not all birth workers,
Yeah.
can do in the hospital setting that would make birth more safe and sacred for Black birthers?
Look at the human being in front of you and use them as your guide. Honor their space, respect their space and their truth of what they're bringing into the room, but start with the human being in front of you. And when I say that, it's the client or for birth worker, or the patient as the birth worker as the OB or the midwife coming in from the hospital side. Really look at that human and connect with that human to hear their journey. Literally could just be the journey from your house to the hospital, but hear them, the human being in front of you. Look at them, support them, be responsive and respectful to what they're saying. And then if you do that, then they will tell you what is true for them. And I think it just makes it that listening deeply is really important. Honoring the process that they're in and how they want to be in birth. That human being is the difference. I mean, for me, in my experience, I know from my experience and all the women over the past 25 plus years that I have witnessed in birth, it has always been honoring their truth, honoring the process, but also giving them the truth in love. And, and knowing that that's what you're there for, right? And then stepping back and watching what happens.
Yeah.
It makes a difference between thriving and not thriving at all, and how they honor their space and how they walk out of their experience. So honoring the human, I would say that over everything and what comes with that. If you honor yourself in that and listening to that little something inside, listen more deeply, step back, take a breath, and then listen even deeper. So you'll hear the human, and the human in you will connect with that human, and you'll have better outcomes.
I can really definitely appreciate that. I think that's one of the biggest things that I've done over the past 2.5 years is to make space to listen,
Yeah.
take
Yeah.
space, take time and just say, hey, we're not going to pack up this schedule because I need more time. I need to hear, I need to listen, I need to connect with that
Connect.
person. Because when you're running in and out of rooms, you can't
Yes.
develop a relationship. You don't hardly get a chance to really,
Mhm.
know that person. And
Right.
then you're at the day of the birth and you don't
Right.
know who's in front of you. And you've
Right.
had 9 months to get to know them, but you've been so busy running in and out of
Mhm.
places because we
Yeah.
built this culture of pay fee for service, and
Yeah.
they pack as many people on a schedule as
Right.
possible. Try to have as many people in labor as possible. You can't spend time.
No.
It's such a culture of just hurry, 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 rush, rush, rush.
Yeah.
Get the next person in,
Oh,
get them in, and get them out.
right.
And there's no real
Yeah.
fostering relationship
Yeah.
where you.
And that's why I do the one thing, the other piece I tell my birth workers is take a breath. So before you go in that room, take a breath and then come in and see that person, right? And then it's creating relationship in real time, right? So not deep relationship, but oh, hi, how are you? I'm so-and-so, I'm here and I see you. I mean, that presence, right? That's really actually one of the first questions I ask when they get interviewed. How do you create relationship in real time?
Yeah.
And I clarified a little bit, but it's like, how do you make connection,
Yeah.
in real time? Yeah.
And then, if your connection fails, how to recover it, you know?
Yes, exactly.
Hey, you know
Exactly.
what? This didn't start off right. Uh,
Right. Let's just
let me walk this back and get this right.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's how culture change happens.
Yes.
Is
Yes.
go back and recover.
Go back and recover and own your stuff.
Yeah.
And that goes for the patient too. Own your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Own
Yeah, and I mean, because like you said, the truth and love, it works both ways. I've had people
Yes,
tell me, "Hey, I didn't like how you talk to me," and I've
right.
told people, "Hey, I don't like how you talking to me,"
Me
and
either. Right.
we have to get that together because this is a
Mhm.
relationship.
That's
When you're talking
right.
about something as sacred as birth, you're talking about
Right.
a relationship
Hmm.
that will be basically never ending because that's a moment
No.
in time that's so powerful
Right.
that it
Right.
links the two of you
It
forever.
forever, forever and ever. Yes, you're right.
So I just so appreciate this
Hmm.
conversation, and I'm looking forward to the day where doula care is available to everyone.
Everyone.
It's such a thing. If you're watching this, call your legislator and say, "Hey, doula care
Yeah.
needs to be something that everyone can have
Have
access to. It should
access
be
to.
covered by insurance." We
Yes.
want that. We're doing that in Georgia. We're
Yes.
piloting a doula care
Hmm.
program, so it should
Hmm.
be available to all women, regardless of their
Yeah.
socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
It should be available to all families because
Yeah.
doulas provide education, they provide support.
Yeah.
There are prenatal and birth and postpartum doulas.
Mhm.
And we know that where doulas are, outcomes are better.
They
So,
are. They are definitely
yeah.
better,
So,
and
so let
they,
your elected officials know that you want doula care for your
yes.
family if you are going.
And look for some of the community-based programs that have linkages and resources to doulas. And don't stop looking for the Black doulas. Let me just tell you that right now, especially in Georgia. They are there. We just got to get them out to the rural parts even more. Right.
Right, and if you are watching here, stay tuned because Shaconna will come back, and I will invite our local doula here in Lagrange. If you're watching on BTV or on my YouTube channel, and I'll post our local doula and Shaconna's information in the description box down below. If you're watching us on YouTube, so I
Thank
thank you,
you.
Shaconna.
Thank
She
you.
is like who I
Mhm.
want to be when I grow up.
Oh,
Um, and definitely been such a resource to me over the past few years as
yes.
we worked on various
Yes.
projects
Oh
on
my goodness.
respectful care, and she's teaching
Yes.
me how to be more respectful, a deeper listener, and just a
Mhm.
better doctor. So I thank you
Yes.
so much for taking the
You're
time to
welcome.
talk to me
Oh, I'm
and
so
to be a
grateful.
part of this series. So all right, y'all, we'll catch you on the next episode. Make sure you stay tuned
Bye.
on BTV and here on YouTube. We'll catch you next time. Peace.
Peace.